Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story starts with a girl who doesn't know what she is, a fortress full of wolves who do, and a king who spent 6 years learning not to feel anything until she walked through his gate. She came for a manuscript. She had no idea she was already written into it. Let's begin. The cart stopped at the outer gate just past midday. Cass climbed down without waiting for the driver to offer a hand. She had a satchel over one shoulder and a leather case strapped across her back, manuscripts inside, wrapped in oilcloth. The case was worth more than everything else she owned. The gate was iron and oak, twice her height. 2 guards stood either side. They looked at her the way people always looked at her when she arrived somewhere alone, trying to decide what category she belonged to. She saved them the trouble. Cass, contracted by your scriptorium. I'm here for the manuscript. The taller guard checked a folded paper, read it twice, looked at her again. You're the translator. That's what I said. He stepped aside. The gate opened. The courtyard was larger than she'd expected. Stone on all sides. The fort had been built in layers, each century adding weight to the one before it. The walls were dark with old rain. The towers were older than the walls, and in the courtyard, between the stables and the great hall entrance, there were wolves, not in animal form. Men and women in rough wool and leather, going about the morning's work, carrying wood, moving grain sacks, sharpening tools. Ordinary, except for the way they moved, the way they held still when they wanted to, the way their eyes tracked without their heads turning. Cass had translated enough pack law documents to know what she was walking into. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward. She was halfway across the courtyard when the first one stopped. A man with a grain sack over his shoulder. He set it down slowly, turned toward her, and lowered his head. Not a bow exactly, more like a weight pulling him down. Something involuntary. She almost stopped walking. Didn't. But then the woman by the stable door did the same thing, and the 2 guards near the well, and the boy carrying firewood who couldn't have been more than 15. One by one, in a ripple moving outward from where she walked, every wolf in the courtyard went still and lowered their head. She counted without meaning to, stopped at 40, and kept walking. She did not look up at the windows. Draven saw it from the 2nd floor. He was mid-sentence, something about the eastern border, something the council had been arguing about for 3 weeks. And then his beta said his name twice, and he still didn't answer because he was watching the courtyard. The translator had arrived. A woman, dark-haired, walking like she knew exactly where she was going, even though she'd never been here. And his wolves were bowing, not performing, not choosing to show respect to a stranger out of courtesy. Bowing the way they bowed to him. The deep, involuntary pull of recognition that moved through a pack when something fundamental shifted. He had seen it once before in his life. 14 years ago, when he first walked into this courtyard as king. He turned from the window. Continue, he said. His beta continued. Draven heard none of it. The scriptorium was in the east tower, 3rd floor. The steward who led her there, a thin man named Pell who walked too fast and talked too much, explained that the manuscript had been found 6 weeks ago during repairs to the foundation, that 3 people had tried to read it, that the oldest scholar in the territory had identified the script as archaic Norse and said they needed someone from outside. How old is it? Cass asked. The parchment suggests 300 years, perhaps more. She nodded. That tracked with what they'd described in the contract. The scriptorium itself had high ceilings, good light from the narrow windows, shelves on every wall stacked with manuscripts in varying states of decay, a long work table in the center, a fireplace on the north wall producing heat in the approximate quantity of a single candle. The manuscript was on the table, already unrolled and weighted at the corners. She pulled on her thin leather gloves and leaned over the table. The script was dense and precise. Whoever had written this had done it carefully, with the kind of attention that meant they believed it mattered. The ink had browned, but held. She could read it. She read the first 3 lines and went very still. Behind her, The door opened. She didn't turn around. She was reading. "You're the translator." The voice was low, controlled, the kind that didn't need volume because the room adjusted to it. "You're the second person to say that to me today," she said. "I'm starting to think it's the only thing anyone here knows about me." A pause. "What's your name?" "Cass." "Just Cass. Just Cass." Another pause. Longer. "I'm told the work will take 2 weeks," he said. "Depends on the manuscript." She still hadn't turned around. "This one is going to take 3. She heard him breathe once. Then the door closed. She turned around. The room was empty. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked back at the manuscript. The first 3 lines read, "Here is set down the covenant of the Morcant line, that the bond of the true mate shall not be broken by law or lord or the passage of years. The mate comes when the blood calls. She will not know what she is until she stands inside the walls." Cass read it twice. Then she picked up her pen and started working. She had been in the scriptorium for 4 days before she saw him again. Not for lack of opportunity. The fort was not large enough to avoid someone entirely. She passed wolves in every corridor, at every meal, crossing every courtyard. They all did the same thing. The ones who had been in the yard on the first day did it immediately, heads dropping before she reached them. The newer ones took a moment longer, like something in them was catching up to something they didn't have a word for. She had stopped counting. She had not stopped thinking about what it meant. The manuscript was slow work. The script was archaic but consistent. Whoever had written it knew what they were doing. It was structured in 3 parts, a covenant, a lineage record, and a third section that used terminology she hadn't encountered before. Words that existed in archaic Norse but had been used here in ways that didn't match any document she'd translated. She worked by the window in the mornings when the light was good, by the fire in the afternoons when it wasn't. Pell brought food twice a day and asked no questions, which she appreciated. On the 4th day, she looked up from the manuscript and found Draven Morcant standing in the doorway. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the table. At her work, maybe. At her. She waited. "You eat at the table," he said. "The light is better here. There's a hall." "I know. Is there a rule about eating in the scriptorium?" He looked at her for a moment. "No." "Then I'll keep eating at the table." He came into the room. That surprised her. She'd expected him to leave, the way he'd left the first time. Instead, he walked to the shelves on the east wall and looked at the manuscripts there, not touching, just looking. She watched him. He was bigger than she'd registered the first day, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than performance. The gray at his temples was more visible in the daylight. The scars on his face were old. Whatever had made them a long time ago. "The third section," she said. "The terminology is unusual. Some of these words, I've seen them in other pack documents, but not used this way." He turned from the shelf. "What do they say?" "I'm still working on it." She paused. "What do you know about the manuscript?" "Less than you, apparently." That's not an answer. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at council members who pushed too far. She held the look. "It was found in the foundation," he said. "The foundation is 400 years old. The fort was built on top of something older." "What was here before the fort?" "No one knows." She turned back to the manuscript. "That's not true. Someone knew. They wrote it down." She tapped the parchment lightly with one gloved finger. "That's why I'm here." The silence stretched, waited, like something in the room was deciding something. "You didn't bow," he said. She looked up. "Sorry?" "When you crossed the courtyard, my wolves bowed. You didn't." "I'm not a wolf." "No." He studied her. "But you noticed. I count things when I'm nervous. You didn't look nervous." "I know." She held his gaze. "That's the point." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a fraction, the jaw tightening, the eyes going a degree quieter. She filed it away without knowing why. He left without saying anything else. She looked at the door after he'd gone. Then she looked at the manuscript. The mate comes when the blood calls. She will not know what she is until she stands inside the walls. She had translated that line on the first day. She had not written it in her notes yet. She wasn't sure why. That night she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the scriptorium. She was still at the table. The third section was pulling at her, something in the phrasing that felt like it was one turn away from making sense. The fire had burned down to coals. The rest of the fort was quiet. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She waited. The door didn't open. She could hear breathing on the other side, slow even, like someone who had stopped and hadn't decided yet what to do about it. She looked at the door, said nothing. After a long moment, the footsteps moved on. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. On the 6th day, the council sent for her. Pell delivered the summons in the morning, visibly uncomfortable. She asked him what it was about. He said he didn't know. She looked at him until he admitted he did know, but wasn't authorized to say. She told him she would come after the midday meal, not before, because she was in the middle of a passage, and interrupting it would cost her 2 hours of reconstruction. She came after the midday meal. The council chamber was on the ground floor of the main hall, a long room with a low ceiling and a table that seated 12. 7 men were seated when she entered. Draven was at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came in. Then he looked at the chair they'd placed across from the council, separated from the table by 6 feet of empty floor, and something in his expression tightened. She sat down, crossed her hands on the table, waited. The man to Draven's left spoke first, gray-haired, careful enunciation. "You're aware that you're human," he said. "I've suspected it for some time, yes." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The gray-haired man did not react. "You're aware that this territory operates under pack law. I read the contract before I signed it. Pack law has provisions regarding humans within the walls, specifically regarding humans who—" he paused, "who have an unusual effect on the pack." She kept her face neutral. "Define unusual." 112 wolves in this territory registered a bond response on the day of your arrival. He folded his hands. "That does not happen. It has not happened in this territory in 14 years. The last time it happened, it was because a new king had arrived." The room was very quiet. She looked at Draven. He was looking at the table. "I'm a translator," she said. "I came for a manuscript." "Yes. And the manuscript, what has it told you so far?" She held the silence for 3 seconds. "I'm not finished. But you've begun." Everyone begins before they finish. That's how reading works. The man's eyes didn't change. "Pack law is clear on this matter. A human who activates a bond response within pack walls is subject to review by the council. We determine whether she stays or is returned to her point of origin." She let that sit for a moment. "You're telling me you can send me home. We're telling you it's a possibility we're required to consider." She looked at each man at the table in turn, counted the ones who had already decided. 4. The other 3 were still watching, still weighing. Then she looked at Draven. He had not said a single word since she'd entered the room. He sat at the head of that table like he'd been carved into it, still, heavy, present in the way that large things were present. But his jaw was tight, and his hands, flat on the table, had not moved once. She knew what a man looked like when he was holding himself very carefully in place. "What does the king say?" she asked. Every head turned toward Draven. He looked up. His eyes met hers across the length of the table. "The translator stays," he said, "until the work is done." The gray-haired man opened his mouth. Draven looked at him. He closed it. That was the end of the meeting. She caught up to Draven in the corridor outside. "Wait." He stopped, turned. "You didn't tell them," she said, "about the manuscript, what it says." "No." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was narrow, and the torchlight was uneven, and he was close enough that she could see the exact line where one of the old scars crossed his jaw. "Because I don't know yet what it means," he said. "I think you do." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A shift so small she almost missed it. Almost. "Finish the translation," he said. "Then we'll talk." He walked away. She stood in the corridor and watched him go. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. She noted it, filed it, and went back to the scriptorium. The third section wasn't going to translate itself. She finished the third section on the 8th night. It took until past midnight. The fire had gone out twice, and she'd rebuilt it twice, and at some point Pell had stopped coming with food, so she'd eaten the bread she kept in her satchel and kept working. Her back hurt. Her eyes hurt. She didn't stop. The third section was not a lineage record. It was not a covenant addendum. It was something she didn't have a clean word for in any of the 5 languages she spoke. A description, precise and clinical, of what happened when a Lycan king of the Morcant line found his true mate. She read it once fast, to get the shape of it. Then she read it again slowly, word by word, making sure she hadn't mistranslated. She hadn't. According to the manuscript, the bond was not chosen. It was not negotiated. It activated on proximity. The mate entering the king's territory for the first time triggered a response in every wolf bonded to the king, because the king's bond was the pack's bond. What one felt, all felt. The bowing was not deference, it was recognition, the pack's body understanding something before the mind caught up. The mate would not feel it the same way. She would feel something, a pull, a wrongness when she moved away from the territory, a rightness when she stayed. But she would not feel the full weight of it until the king named her, until he spoke it out loud, in front of witnesses, under pack law. Until then, she was just a woman in a fort full of wolves who kept lowering their heads when she walked past. Cass sat back in her chair. She thought about the footsteps in the corridor, the ones that stopped outside her door and didn't come in. She thought about the way he'd said the translator stays in that council chamber, flat and final, no explanation offered, none needed. She thought about his hands on the table. Flat, still, holding. She picked up the manuscript and went to find him. It was past midnight. The fort was quiet. She didn't know where his chambers were, so she went to the only other place she'd seen him. The second-floor corridor overlooking the courtyard, where Pell had mentioned the king kept his working rooms. She found him there. Not in a room. In the corridor itself, standing at the window, looking out at the dark courtyard below. He was still dressed. He hadn't slept. She stopped a few feet away, set the manuscript down on the stone ledge between them. "I finished," she said. He looked at the manuscript, then at her. "The third section," she said. "I know what it is. I know what the bowing means. I know what you've known since I walked through your gate." He said nothing. "I want to hear you say it," she said. "Not the manuscript. You." The corridor was cold. The torches had burned low and the light was uneven, and she could hear the wind outside working at the stone. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that went quieter instead of louder when something moved behind them. "You're my mate," he said. 3 words. No ornament. The way he said everything, like it had been weighed before it was spoken. She held them for a moment. "How long have you known?" "Since the courtyard, when I saw them bow." "That was the first day." "Yes." She looked out the window at the dark courtyard below. The same courtyard she'd crossed 8 days ago, not knowing what she was walking into. "The manuscript says you have to name me," she said. "In front of witnesses, under pack law. That's what makes it binding." Yes. And if you don't? He was quiet for a moment. Then you finish the work. You leave. The bond stays. It doesn't dissolve. But it goes unnamed. And an unnamed bond. He stopped. What happens to an unnamed bond? It hollows you out, he said. Slowly. Both of you. She turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window. You've been standing in this corridor every night, she said. Outside my door. He didn't deny it. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because telling you meant asking you to choose something you didn't come here to choose. She looked at him for a long time. The line of his jaw. The scars. The gray at his temples that caught the torchlight. There was someone before, she said. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened. Yes. She left. She chose another territory. He said it the way he said everything, flat, final. But underneath it was something that had been carried a long time. She could hear the weight of it. And you stopped naming things after that, she said. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way he hadn't let himself do since the first day. Yes, he said quietly. She picked up the manuscript from the ledge, held it for a moment. I'm going to sleep, she said. And tomorrow I want to talk. Not about the bond, about you, about what you're actually afraid of. She met his eyes. Can you do that? Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. Yes, he said. She left him in the corridor. He stood there for a long time after she was gone. She came to find him after breakfast. Not the scriptorium, not the council chamber. She found him in the yard below the east tower, working with 2 of his betas on something involving a section of damaged wall. He was doing the actual work, moving stone, not supervising. His hands were dirty. He looked up when she approached and said something to the betas that sent them to the other end of the yard. She stopped a few feet from him. You said yes last night, she said. To talking. I remember. So talk. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down on the low section of wall he'd been repairing and rested his forearms on his knees. She sat beside him. Not close. Just near. The yard was quiet. The morning light was flat and cold, the kind that made everything look like it had been there forever. Her name was Alice, he said. We were bonded for 3 years. She was Pack. Born here, grew up here. I named her in front of the full council the year I took the throne. He paused. I thought naming something made it real, made it permanent. What happened? The Vale territory sent an ambassador. He was here for 2 months negotiating a border agreement. He looked at his hands. She left with him when he went home. Cass said nothing. Let him keep the pace. Pack law allows it, he said. A mate can dissolve a bond if both parties agree to release it. I agreed because she asked me to, because refusing would have meant holding someone who didn't want to be held. He exhaled slowly. The council said I handled it with dignity. I think I just didn't know what else to do. And after that, you stopped. After that, I ran 3 territories alone and decided that was enough. Was it? He looked at her. No. She looked out at the yard. A pair of wolves were crossing the far end, heads down against the wind. One of them glanced toward her and dipped their chin before looking away again. She was starting to get used to it. I'm not her, Cass said. I know. I don't mean it as reassurance. I mean, I need you to see me. Not what you lost. Not what you're afraid of losing again. Me. She turned to look at him. I came here with a leather case full of manuscripts and no plan beyond the work. I'm not here because of the bond. I didn't know about the bond. I know that too. Then what are you afraid of? He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard and the torches on the far wall bent sideways and straightened again. That it won't be enough, he said, naming you. that I'll do it and you'll stay for a season, and then understand what it means to be bound to a king and a territory and a pack and decide the cost is too high. That's not a reason not to try. No, he said. It's just a fear. She looked at him. The set of his shoulders. The way he held still under pressure. Not because nothing was moving inside him, but because he'd learned that moving made it worse. You said last night that an unnamed bond hollows you out, she said. Both of us. Yes. I've been feeling it since the third day. She said it plainly, no drama in it. I thought it was the cold, or the work. But it wasn't that. It was every time I left the scriptorium and walked to the far end of the fort, something pulled, like I'd left something behind. She paused. I didn't know what it was until last night. He was very still. I'm not afraid of staying, she said. I'm not afraid of the bond. I've read enough pack law to know what it means, and I'm not afraid of it. She held his gaze. I'm afraid you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave and miss the part where I don't. He looked at her for a long time. The wind came through the yard again. She didn't move. Neither did he. The council meets on Friday, he said. I know. I want to name you then, in front of all of them. He said it the way he said things that mattered, carefully, like each word had been picked up and examined before being set down. Not because pack law requires it, because I want there to be witnesses. I want it said out loud in a room full of people so there's no way to pretend it didn't happen. She felt something settle in her chest, quiet and solid. Friday, she said. Friday. She stood up, brushed the stone dust from her skirt. He stood too, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the exact gray of his eyes in the flat morning light. She didn't move back. Neither did he. Finish the wall, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Close enough. She left him in the yard. She was back in the scriptorium before she let herself breathe properly. 3 days until Friday. Friday came with frost on the stone and a sky the color of slate. Cass was at the work table when Pell came for her. She had spent the last 3 days finishing the translation. Every line, every section, clean and complete. She had made 2 copies in her best hand and left them both on the table weighted at the corners. The work was done. Whatever happened next, the work was done. She followed Pell down the tower stairs and across the courtyard. The wolves were out again, more of them than she'd seen in the yard at once, not working, not moving through on errands, standing, watching. When she crossed the courtyard, every head went down, one after another, the ripple moving outward the same way it had on the first day. But slower this time, more deliberate, like something that knew what it was doing. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward. The council chamber was full. Not just the 7 men from before. Every senior member of the pack was there, 30, perhaps more, standing along the walls because the table could not hold them all. The gray-haired man was in his seat. The others were in theirs. And at the head of the table, standing, was Draven. He was dressed differently than she'd seen him. Not ceremonially. No robes, no ornament. But the leather was clean, and the clasp at his shoulder was silver, and he stood like the room had been built around him. He looked at her when she entered. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. The gray-haired man, she had learned his name was Corin, stood. This council is convened under pack law, Article 9, regarding the naming of a mate bond. The king has invoked his right to name. He looked at Cass. The human woman Cass stands as the named. She has been informed of the terms and implications under pack law. He sat down. The room was completely silent. Draven stepped around the table. He walked to where she was standing and stopped in front of her. Close. The same distance as the wall in the yard, the corridor outside her door, every moment in the last 8 days where something had almost been said and hadn't. She looked up at him. I need to ask you something first, she said quietly. Just for him. He waited. Not the bond, not the law. She held his gaze. Do you want this? Not because the manuscript says it's real, not because the pack already feels it. Do you want this? Something in his face shifted. The careful stillness cracked open, just slightly, just enough. Yes, he said, low, certain. The way he said things he had examined from every angle and decided were true. She nodded once. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm. She felt the pull she'd been feeling since the third day settle into something steady, like a sound that had been just below hearing suddenly becoming clear. He turned to face the room. I name Cass as my mate, he said, under pack law, before this council and this pack. The bond is spoken. It stands. The room exhaled, not dramatically, not all at once. A slow release of held breath moving through 30 people simultaneously, like a tide going out. The gray-haired man closed his eyes for a moment. 2 of the wolves along the wall pressed fists to their chests. Someone near the back made a sound that was not quite a word. Corin stood again. The naming is witnessed. The bond is recorded. He looked at Cass. Welcome to Morcant. She looked around the room. All those faces, all those people who had been bowing in corridors and courtyards for 8 days without her understanding why. She understood now. She turned back to Draven. His hand was still holding hers. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that had gone quieter than she'd ever seen them. Not closed off. Just still. The stillness of something that had finally stopped bracing. You're going to keep eating in the scriptorium, he said. Yes. The fire in there is inadequate. I know. I've been rebuilding it twice a day since I arrived. I'll have it fixed. I'd appreciate that. The corner of his mouth moved, the same almost smile from the yard. She was starting to understand that this was what it looked like on him, as far as it went, and enough. The council members were beginning to move, quiet conversations starting along the walls, the formal weight of the ceremony lifting into something ordinary. Pell was already hovering near the door with the expression of a man who had 17 administrative questions and was deciding which one to ask first. Draven didn't move. Neither did she. The 3rd day, he said quietly. You said you felt it on the 3rd day. Yes. I felt it on the 1st. He paused. Before you crossed the courtyard, when the gate opened. She looked at him. That's why you were at the window. I was trying to understand what I was feeling before I had to act like I wasn't feeling it. How long did that work? About 4 minutes. She laughed. Short and real. It surprised her. It seemed to surprise him, too. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the scriptorium that first day, when she'd told him the work would take 3 weeks and hadn't turned around. Like something in her kept landing differently than he expected. She thought she could live with being unexpected. She thought she could live with a lot of things, in a fort made of 4 centuries of stone, with frost on the windows, and a fire that needed rebuilding, and a king who stood outside doors at midnight rather than knock. She would teach him to knock. Eventually. His hand was still in hers. She didn't let go. He didn't either. Outside, in the courtyard, the wolves went back to their work. The grain sacks moved. The tools sharpened. The ordinary motion of a morning in a pack that had just settled into something it had been waiting 8 days to become. The frost on the stone began to melt. And that's where we leave them. A king who spent 6 years afraid to name anything. And a girl who made him say it out loud in front of everyone on a Friday morning with frost on the stone. I need to know what you thought of Cass, because she is not like the others we've had here. She didn't bow. She didn't run. She sat in that scriptorium and translated the very manuscript that was written about her, and she still made him ask. Drop in the comments, Team Cass, or did Draven steal the story for you? And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a good love story today. It helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.